Hello everyone! So today is gagawa tayo ng isang video tutorial kung paano gumawa ng isang simpleng laro gamit ang Python Pygame. So the first thing we need to do is to add these imports, which are import OS. This module provides a portable way of using operating system dependent functionality. It allows you to interact with the operating system such as working with files and directories. Import Pygame. Pygame is a cross-platform set of Python modules designed for writing video games. It includes computer graphics and sound libraries, making it suitable for game development. Import Random. This module implements pseudo-random numbers generators for various distributions. It's commonly used in games for generating random numbers, such as for randomizing game elements or creating random events. From collections, import Name Tuple. This function returns a new subclass of tuple with name fields. It's useful for creating simple classes to represent data structures with a fixed set of attributes. From ABC, import ABC or abstract method. These are parts of abstract-based classes ABC's module in Python. ABC is a helper class that allows you to define abstract-based classes. Next is screen and display parameters. Screen width and screen height, these variables determine the dimensions of the game window. Lightness Sky Max, maximum lightness value for the sky color. Color Sky, RGB color tuple representing the color of the sky. Color Grass, RGB color tuple representing the color of the grass. Color Font, RGB color tuple representing the color of the font used in the game. Color Rope, RGB color tuple representing the color of the rope in the game. Font Name, fat to the TrueType font file used for displaying text in the game. Game Score Parameters. Score Table. This list seems to represent a scoring system. Game Physics Parameters. Gravity. This variable likely represents the gravitational constant or force in the game. Game Object. Inherits from Pygame.sprite, which is base class for visible game objects. Constructor Init. Parameters. This parameter represents the images of the game. Top left. This parameter is a tuple representing the initial position of the game object's top left corner on the screen. Speed. This parameter is a list of two integers representing the movement speed of the game object. Overall, this class provides a basic structure for game objects, allowing them to initialize with an image, position, and speed. Subclasses can extend this functionality to implement specific behaviors for different type of game objects. Property. This property allows access to the image attribute of the game object. It provides convenient way to retrieve the image associated with the game object. Property similar to the image property, this property allows access to the rect attributes of the game object. It provides a convenient way to retrieve the bounding rectangle of the game object. Init Class Method. This method is defined as a class method decorator. Class methods are methods that are bound to the class itself rather than its instances. This bow class represents a bow object in the game. Bow inherits from the game object class, which means it inherits its properties and methods. Image. This attribute stores the image of the bow loaded from the file. Rope top and rope butt. These attributes define the coordinates of the top and bottom ends of the bow string. Rope states. These attributes specify the number of the animation states from the bow string. Pause init. These attributes represent the initial position of the bow on the screen. Speed. This attribute defines the speed which the bow moves. It's a list containing the horizontal and vertical methods. Ammo Max. This attribute specifies the maximum number of the arrows that bow can shoot. Force Min and Force Max. These attributes define the minimum and maximum forces that can be applied to arrows when shooting. Time Forces. These attributes represent the time interval, in seconds, during which the player can adjust the shooting force. Time Cooldown. These attributes specify the cooldown time, in seconds, between consecutive shots. This init method initializes an instance of the bow class. Initialization. This method takes a context parameter, which is presumably used to keep track of the game's context, possibly including the score. It calls the superclass. Game Object Init method to initialize the bow object. It passes the bow's image, initial position, and speed obtained from the bow class attributes. Self-Arrow. This attribute is initialized with the arrow class. Self-Ammo. This attribute represents the current ammunition count of the bow. Self-State. This attribute represents the state of the bow. Self-Context. This attribute stores the context passed during initialization. This method updates and shoot are part of the bow class. Update self inputs. This method is responsible for updating the position of the bow and performing other state-specific updates. If the bow is going out of the screen, it inverts its speed to make it bounce back. This logic ensures that the bow stays within the screen boundaries. Shoot self. This method is called when the bow shoots an arrow. It calculates the top left position of the arrow based on the bow's position. This draw method seems to be responsible for drawing the bow's image based on its state. Method signature. Draw self step. This method takes a parameter step which likely represents the current animation step or state of the bow's animation. Redrawing the bow's image. Self.image is equal bow.image copy. It creates a copy of the original bow image. Overlay is equal pygame.surface self.image.getSize. It creates a surface overlay with the same size as the bow image. If step is 1, it means the bow is not in the shooting state. In this case, it draws a line representing the row from the top to the bottom of the bow using pygame.drawThatLine. If the step is not 1, it calculates the position of the arrow on the bow string based on the step value. It draws 2 lines representing the upper and lower parts of the bow string. Overlay.set, color key overlay.get. It sets the color key of the overlay surface to make the background transparent. Self.image bleed overlay. It bleeds draws the overlay surface on the bow image. This method appears to be used to visually update the appearance of the bow based on its current state or animation step. It adds visual elements such as bowstring and arrow to the bow image to reflect its state accurately. Normal bow state class represents the initial state of a bow instance where it waits for inputs, such as a key press for transition to a different state. The constructor takes a master parameter which presumably represents the bow instances associated with its state. It calls the draw method of the bow instance. Self.master.draw passing 0 as the step parameter. This likely ensures that the bow is drawn in its default state. Update method. The update method is responsible for handling inputs and potentially transitioning to a different state based on those inputs. It takes an inputs parameter which is expected to be a list of input events. It iterates over each input event in the input. This bent bow state class represents the state of the bow instance when it's bent, accumulating force to shoot an arrow. Constructor init. The constructor takes a master parameter which presumably represents the bow instance associated with its state. It initializes the master attribute with the provided master instance. It sets master.bendTime to 0. This attribute likely represents the amount of the time the bow has been bent. Accumulating force. Update method. The update method is responsible for updating the state of the bow while it's bent and handling inputs. It takes an inputs parameter which is expected to be a list of input events. It checks if the bend time, master.bendTime is less than a certain threshold. Bow.time force FPS. This threshold likely represents the maximum time the bow can bend before releasing the arrow. If the bend time is less than the threshold, it increments the bend time and calculates the animation step based on the current bend time and predefined animation step. It then calls the draw method of the bow instance. Self.master.drawStep. To visually update the appearance of the bow, it iterates over each input event in the input list. If an input event is a key release, pygame.keyUp checks if the release key is the spacebar. These two classes, reload bow state and empty bow state, represent different states of the bow instance. Reload bow state. It initializes the master attribute with the provided master instance. It's called the draw method of the bow instance with step value of 1. This likely indicates that no specific visual change is needed for the state. Empty bow state. It takes a master parameter representing the bow instance associated with its state. It initializes the master attribute with the provided master instance. These classes encapsulate the behavior of the bow in different states. Reloading and empty, they manage the bow's visual appearance and behavior based on its current state, ensuring that the game mechanics function as expected. This arrow class represents an arrow object in the game. Arrow inherits from the game object class, which means it inherits properties and methods from it. Images. This attribute is a list containing images of the arrow. The first image is used when the arrow is shot, and the second image is used when the arrow is stopped. Shot and stop. These attributes represent indexes to access the respective images in the image list. Hitbox offset and hitbox size. The self-target is set to target that instance, presumably representing the targets the arrow can collide with. Self-context is set to the provided context parameter. The arrow instances is added to the instances group using arrow.instances that add self. Update method. This method updates the position of the arrow. If the arrow speed is not 0, indicating that it's moving, gravity is applied to the arrow's vertical speed. Self.speed 1 plus is equal gravity, simulating its downward acceleration. The arrow's position, rectangle, and hitbox are moved based on its speed. If the arrow goes beyond the screen boundaries, it's killed using super kill. The method checks if the arrow collides with any target. Zone is equal self.hitbox.collides list score property. This property allows access to the score attributes of the arrow class. Target class. This class represents a target that needs to be hit in the game. Class attributes: outer one, middle one, and inner one. These attributes represent the indicates of the target areas. Areas. This attributes is a list of tuples representing the hitbox coordinates for each other target area. Image. This attribute holds the image of the target. Instance. This class attribute is intended to hold a single instance of the target class. This property returns the image of the target. Rectangle. This property returns the rectangle representing the position and size of the target. Hitbox. This property returns a tuple containing the hitboxes for the inner, middle, and outer areas of the target. These properties allow external code to access important attributes of the target class such as image, position, and hitboxes in a controlled manner. Init class method. This method initializes the context subclass. It sets the value for the class attribute game context class. This class represents the game context containing all actual game logic. Background. The background feature bound to change minimally during the whole game. Score. The score of the game. Score font. The font used to write out the score on screen. Init initializes game context object during the initialization. It creates the background, initializes the score, sets the score font, initiates instances of the bow and target classes, and sets the drawn attribute to false. Update score method. This method updates the context score depending on the zone hit by the arrow. It draws the arrow on the background and refreshes the whole screen. It takes parameters zone and arrow, where zone represents the zone hit by the arrow and arrow is the arrow instances that hit the target. Custom menu class. This class represents the customizable menu. Class attribute. Color default. Default color for menu background. Image cursor. Image for the cursor. Option. A name tuple representing an option in the menu. It consists of a name, the option's name, and an instruction. Update. Updates the game state based on the user input. It bleeds the background onto the screen if it hasn't drawn yet. It clears the previous position of bows and arrows, updates the position of bows and arrows, draw bows, arrows onto the screen, updates the score surface, and handles switching to another context. If the user presses the escape key, these additions establish the game context and define how the game state is updated and rendered on the screen. The game context class encapsulates the game logic and provides method to update the game state and handle user input. Color default. Default color for menu background. Image cursor. Image for the cursor. Option. A name tuple representing an option in the menu. It consists of a name, the option's name, and an instruction, the action to perform when the option is selected. Margin size and cursor size. To be initialized, initializer init initializes the menu with the title, a dictionary of option, an optional background for the menu, and font sizes. initializes attributes for the title, options, and cursor portion. It initializes attributes for the title, options, and cursor position. It prepares the background surface for the menu, drawing the background images or solid color. It initializes fonts for rendering text. It prepares a tiny background to be drawn behind every option. It writes options and the title over the background surface. It sets drawn to false, indicating whether the whole display needs to be refreshed. Update method updates the menu state based on the user inputs. It bleeds the background onto the screen if it hasn't drawn yet, and draws the cursor. It handles user inputs for navigating the menu options and selecting an option using the arrow keys and enter key. If an option is selected, it sets drawn to false, indicating that the whole display needs to be refreshed, and return the instruction associated with the selected option. These additions extend the functionality of the game context class to handle updating the game score and introduce the custom menu class for the creating customizable menus in the game. The custom menu class provides method for rendering the menu and handling user inputs to navigate and select options. Pause I. This method calculates the position. Draw option. This method draws a menu option on the screen. Cursor rect. This method calculates the position and size of the cursor rectangle based on the current cursor position. Delete cursor. This method removes the cursor from the screen by bleeding the background surface over the area occupied by the cursor. Draw cursor. This method draws the cursor on the screen at the current cursor position. Property cursor defines a getter method for the cursor attribute. Cursor setter defines a setter method for the cursor attribute. Getter returns the current value of the cursor attribute. Title defines the getter method for the title attribute. Font size defines a getter method for the font size attribute. Main menu CLS. This is the factory method itself. It takes a class CLS as its first parameter, which conventionally is named CLS, though you can name it anything. Method body. It initializes variables necessary to create the main menu instances. It sets the title of the main menu to Archery. It defines option for the main menu using a dictionary where the keys are the options labels, play or quit, and then values are the actions associated with those options. Game new quit switch. Pause CLS. This method creates and returns an instance of the class representing a pause menu. It initializes the title attribute to pause. It defines options for the pause menu using a dictionary where the keys are the option labels resume, menu, or quit, and the values are the actions associated with those options. Game switch, menu switch, quit switch. It creates a surface for the option backgrounds. Option back. Init screen. This method is a class initializer which initializes class attributes. It calls the superclass initializer. Dummy context. This line defines a name tuple called dummy context with a single field named update. Quit context. Lambda. Dummy context quit function. This idle sprite, image, pause, background. Darken color. Base color, current color, counter. This function randomly returns a darker version of current color or the base color depending on the value of counter. The prob variable is calculated based on counter. The higher counter, the less likely a darker color will be returned. If a darker color is chosen, the lightness component I of the current color is reduced to darkening. Draw background. Size sky stripes equals 1. Creates and returns a surface representing the background of a game environment, ground with the specified size, which is a tuple with height. Sky drawing. It divides the background into two sections, sky and grass. The sky occupies the upper half of the background. It iterates through sky stripes, name of the stripes in the sky. For each stripe, it calculates the height and color of the stripe. It gradually darkens the color of each stripe from the horizon to the top of the sky. It draws each stripe onto the background surface using pygame.draw.rect. Grass drawing. It calculates the starting vertical position, sky bottom, of the grass based on the last stripe drawn. It creates a pixel array object from the background surface to efficiently manipulate individual pixels. The darken color function adjusts the color of the grass based on the counter, gradually darkening the grass color towards the bottom of the screen. Scaling and compensation. It scales the background surface to match the screen size. Screen width and screen height. It converts the background surface to the pixel format of this display surface for better performance. Return. It returns the completed background surface. Context change. Context DICT instruction. This function takes a dictionary context DICT containing context entries and an instruction string as in it. The instruction string is split into two parts using a space delimiter, change the context to be changed, and option the action to be performed from the context. If the option is switched, the function retrieves the instance associated with the given change key from the context DICT. If the option is new, the function creates a new instance of the context class associated with the given change key and updates the context DICT with the new instance. Finally, the function returns the new context. This block tests the context change function. It initializes pygame, sets up the screen caption, icon, clock, and frames per second. Bow, arrow, and target are game objects. The init methods are called to initialize this object. The FPS frames per second is passed to the bow init method. Game context and custom menu are different contexts of the game. Example, gameplay or menus. They are initialized with the game screen, which is presumably a pygame display surface. Context entry is a name tuple to store the context class and its instance. Different context entries are created in the main menu, post menu, and game context and quit context. A dictionary context DICT is created to map context names to their respective context entries. The initial active context is set to the main menu instances. The game runs an infinite loop to continuously update the game and state and handle inputs. The loop processes pygame events. Pygame quit event changes the active context to the quit context. Pygame.keydown and pygame key up events are added to the inputs list for the further processing. The update method of the current active context is called with the collected inputs. If update returns an instruction, context change function is called to change the active context accordingly. Pygame display flip updates the entire display with the new frame. Clock that ticks controls the game loop to run at specified frames per second.